Of U.S. diplomatic practice. Today, President-elect Donald Trump spoke on the phone with the president of Taiwan. This happened without any contact with either the State Department or the White House, according to an administration official. Trump tweeted twice about this tonight. First, there was the president of Taiwan called me today to wish me congratulations on winning the presidency. Thank you. And then, interesting how the U.S. sells Taiwan billions of dollars in military equipment, but I should not accept a congratulatory call. CNN Global Affairs correspondent Elise Labott is in Washington with the latest. What more do we know about how this all came about?
Well, we understand that an advisor to President-elect Trump's transition team, Stephen Yates, he's a very pro-Taiwan former official with the Reagan administration, with the Bush administration, with Vice President Cheney. He was in Taiwan and he helped facilitate the call. We understand that this wasn't done, as you said, Anderson, without any notification from the White House or the State Department, which is keeping in with what President-elect Trump has done. He hasn't contacted the State Department or the White House for any of these calls, and that's one of the concerns here, is that, you know, usually these kind of briefings are, you know, talk to the officials, talk to the president-elect, tell him a little bit about the sensitivities involved, and clearly this is going to cause a diplomatic uproar with China, and you know, we really don't know whether this was kind of a message that he was sending to China, or just as he said in his tweets, you know, taking a congratulatory phone call. That's what he said in his readout. It was a congratulatory phone call. They talked about relations with Taiwan. The Taiwanese said they talked about strengthening that relationship in the call, but it almost doesn't matter really what they talked about. The fact that they had this call really is the message here.
China's contacted now the White House in reaction to this call. Do we know much about that?
We don't know that much about that. I mean, you can imagine what they're saying. They're like, what is this about? Is this mean that President-elect Trump is going to upend the one China policy, which this is 1979 for 4 decades? But the fact is they really can't say anything. I mean, the President Obama's administration doesn't know about what President-elect Trump is going to do. There's been a lot of uncertainty created. He sent some mixed messages. He's talked about being very tough on China, making them a currency manipulator. But he does have some very pro-China advisors who say that this is one of the most important relationships, and they're even advocating a grand bargain with China. So I don't think the administration is going to really have too many satisfying answers for the Chinese.
And is the Trump transition team making formal use of State Department resources for these calls with foreign leaders?
Well, it's really interesting. President-elect Trump has made some 50 phone calls with world leaders, these congratulatory phone calls. They're supposed to be very perfunctory, getting to know you, looking forward to working with you. But the State Department stands at the ready for a briefing for some of these calls. His team has not reached out at all. I did hear tonight that Vice President-elect Pence, who has also been taking some of these phone calls, did reach out to the State Department. They did provide him with some briefing papers. So it's kind of an interesting dichotomy why President-elect Trump, some would say, is kind of winging it, while Vice President-elect Pence is taking a more considered approach.
All right, Elise Labott, appreciate the update. As we mentioned, China very quickly reacted to the call. Let's get the latest now from CNN White House correspondent Michelle Kaczynski. What are you learning tonight, Michelle?
Hi, Anderson. Well, we know that almost immediately, as soon as the world got word of this very interesting phone call, Chinese officials reached out to the White House. That says a lot. What isn't saying a lot right now is the White House itself. They don't want to comment on diplomatic conversations. But let's just say that this was a discussion that happened, and China has questions. Well, there's really not a lot that the White House can convey at this point. They likely emphasized what the White House has said publicly about this, that the White House adheres to the one China policy, meaning they believe Taiwan is a part of China, and they address diplomatic relations accordingly. What they can't lend China is any real clarity on how relations and diplomacy will change. And this is the same problem that the president has had as he's been on his recent foreign trips, where world leaders want to know what's going to change and what's going to happen, and the White House doesn't have the answers to that.
Yeah. Michelle Kaczynski, appreciate it tonight. Thank you. Joining me now is former Ambassador Christopher Hill. He served as Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs from 2005 to 2009. Ambassador Hill, thanks for being with us. What is your reaction to this? I mean, when you first heard about this phone call and the few details about it, what did you make of it?
Well, my first reaction was this was kind of unintended. They had a phone call from the president of Taiwan, and they thought as a courtesy they'd take the call. One worries, however, certainly listening to some of the people in the Trump transition side, that they feel this is the way to change a policy that's been around for 40 years. And, you know, Ronald Reagan adhered to this policy, George W. Bush adhered to it, everyone adhered to it. And so it's a little odd to try to change a policy with a phone call without any consultations in the Congress, the Senate, and of course with the outgoing administration. So I guess what I'm concerned about is I still think it's in something that's kind of inadvertent, but I am a little concerned that the president-elect will want to double down on it and suggest this is good policy. And by the way, this is a time we have a lot of things going on with the Chinese. We have South China Sea, we have North Korea, we have huge trade problems, we have issues in the UN, sanctions, etc. This is no time to introduce a new crisis point in the U.S.-China relationship.
We just heard CNN reporting that a man named Stephen Yates, whom you know, a Trump transition advisor who supported Taiwanese independence in the past, formerly advised Vice President Cheney, helped facilitate the call. To be clear, the president-elect says the Taiwanese leader called him, but what do you make of an apparent involvement by Mr. Yates?
It's hard to say. I mean, when he was working for Vice President Cheney, his sort of portfolio was Taiwan, and he sort of merrily went ahead on things with China, with Taiwan, without too much regard for China. He was very much of an advocate for these arms sales to Taiwan, but those arms sales are kind of laid out in the original Taiwan Relations Act, which is one of the twin, founding documents of the U.S.-China relationship. We have one China policy that is all official contacts must be with mainland China, but we do have something called the Taiwan Relations Act, which includes the idea that we help Taiwan defend itself, and that's where these weapon sales come from. The Chinese don't like them, but they've accepted them over the decades.
To those who are watching and hear this and think, well, maybe this isn't such a bad idea, putting China a little bit on edge about what the future holds, and maybe things will be different, and maybe they need to be different in their relations with the U.S.
Well, I think it's the old thing. If you want to make news, you ought to know that you're going to make news, and it shouldn't be inadvertent. I would argue if you're going to change a policy of 40 years, it's been subscribed to by Democrats and Republicans alike, you might want to give some thought to it. You might want to do some consultations with people, and you might want to decide whether this is maybe a time to change something. But as far as we know, there wasn't any discussion whatsoever before this phone call, so it does have kind of a look of winging it, and I think it's a little ominous if this is the kind of modus operandi we're going to see. I mean, these issues are complicated. It's been around for 40 years. We're talking about this because it's a complicated issue. And I think people need to understand that, there are people who spend their lifetimes studying this, understanding it. And I don't think we can completely disintermediate all the experts at the State Department or the National Security Council staff.
Ambassador Hill, I appreciate your time tonight. Thank you. Joining me on the phone is New York Times columnist Thomas Friedman, author of the recently published "Thank You for Being Late, An Optimist's Guide to Thriving in the Age of Accelerations." So, Tom, you heard Ambassador Hill. How big of a deal do you think this is?
Well, we're going to have to see, first of all, Anderson, how the Chinese react, and not just with the phone call, but whether they take some substantive actions themselves. But I do agree with what Chris said, which is that there's a case for Trump having his own China policy. Maybe it'll be a little tougher on trade. Maybe it'll be a little tougher geopolitically in the South China Sea. But that policy, Anderson, should be achieved after he sits down with his Secretary of Commerce, to understand the economic implications, his Secretary of State to understand the diplomatic implications, and the Secretary of Defense to understand the security implications. Because there are enormous trade-offs on all those fronts. There's no sign that that was done at all. What this sounds like is a very aggressive member of his transition team, very pro-Taiwanese. I love and admire the Taiwanese. I've always enjoyed going to Taiwan. But they have their own agenda, and they are not above currying influence for their agenda with various people in Washington, D.C. We need to have our own agenda as well and not get sucked into that. We're talking about an island of 20 million people and China of 1.3 billion. So there's a case for a different policy, but it should be done in a considered way. Just one issue that Chris raised. What if in a month, Anderson, we discover that North Korea has in fact developed an intercontinental ballistic missile that can reach the west coast of the United States, and we really need China's cooperation and help in trying to deter that? What if they say, what if they don't take our phone call? There's enormous trade-offs here on multiple fronts, and what you don't get the sense of when the president-elect says, well, he called me. I mean, what did they just call the house? And his wife said, honey, the president of Taiwan's on the phone. This was obviously set up, and if it was set up, it had to be considered, and it doesn't really feel like it was considered because it does, in effect, challenge a very long policy that, you know what, has kept the South China Sea, the U.S.-China-Taiwan relationship, not only relatively stable now for 4 decades, but really prosperous and really benefiting all three countries.
It certainly puts a renewed focus on whom the president-elect is going to choose to be his Secretary of State. I mean, there's a lot of talk about how that person will have a big portfolio to represent the U.S. around the world, but at the same time representing the policy of Donald Trump.
But I think the Secretary of State, he or she, whoever it is, will be very important. But what's most important are the impulses and instincts of the president-elect, and they are multiple. We see here because he is for getting rid of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Treaty, which yes was a free trade agreement or a trade promotion agreement, but it was also a de facto security agreement. It was by all our key non-China trading partners, and that trade agreement and the rules it laid down, both on trade and other issues like human trafficking, the right to organize labor unions, it was a de facto security alliance. So when you get rid of that, when you just throw that out the window, you leave all those countries, well, they're going to go closer to China, look for more protection with China, and get more deeply integrated economically with China. The point is, what's worrying to me, and look, every president, the president-elect, they're going to make some stumbles. I've seen this with every administration. I'm not going to jump down their throat from day one. I mean, but at the same time, there's a certain cavalier attitude about big systems. NATO, who needs it? The EU, let it crack up. Taiwan, U.S.-China relations, I can take a phone call. These are big systems that have been put in place over a long period of time. They are imperfect. A lot of them could use some refreshing. A lot of them could use some repair, even some new and invigorating ideas. But these systems have kept the world peaceful and prosperous. Our main Western allies and relationships for a lot of years now, and you don't play around with big systems.
Tom Friedman, a lot to watch for. Thank you very much, Tom. Appreciate it. Coming up, an incredibly heated debate between top Clinton and Trump campaign staff. Accusations, lying, dog whistles, cozying up to white supremacists. Plus, Van Jones and Jeffrey Lord talk about how Democrats and Republicans move forward in the face of lingering vitriol.